Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about freedom now, within, in, freedom now, in.
Habari Gani. Thank you to everyone who donated their time as volunteers or donated financially during our recent fund drive. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this last Saturday of 2024 on the Gregorian calendar, December 28th, which is also the third day of the Kwanzaa principle, Ujima, collective work and responsibility. We commence today's program with our ancestor Didon Kamati in the African drumbeat historical calendar. Then, prolific author, radical historian, professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Casarae Abdul-Ghani, associate professor of English at Temple University and author of the book Start a Riot, Civil Unrest in Black Arts Movement, Drama, Fiction, and Poetry. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Crystal Nicole Eddins, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh and author of the book Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, AC Alone, Sean Dobbins, Quincy Jones, Freddie Hubbard, Chick Corea, prison radio commentaries, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always we stand ready for revolution.
The American capitalist system, a backward system, has a way of presenting history as if history is made by one man, one great woman. And that this great man, this great woman comes along and directs the dumb masses who follow them for whatever reasons, and they light up the way to show the people how to go in the darkness. So whenever you study, for example, the American Revolution, you say George Washington, that means you know everything. You say Abraham Lincoln. Even in recent years of the struggle today, you could say Martin Luther King. See? The attempt is to make it appear as if history is made indeed by these a great person. And usually our history is not made by us, but really made by one great person outside of our race, usually a great white man. Thus, in the Civil War, we did absolutely nothing. It was Abraham Lincoln. As a matter of fact, recently, some lot of garbage is written in books by people who call themselves historians, making it appear as if we have to thank Lyndon Baines Johnson for the advancement because he signed the Civil Rights Bill. Of course he signed it. But while he was signing it, we were in the streets burning the country down. You better hurry up and sign it. Burn the whole country down. Do it quick. But if you're not careful, you will thank Lyndon Baines Johnson.
We have just heard Kwame Ture on history. This is Didan Kamathi with this week's edition of the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. This internationalist calendar brings to our attention the righteous struggles of the oppressed women, workers, peasants, and nationalities who have been preyed upon by the economic systems of exploitation. We give life by praising up our struggle for a human-centered world. December 29, 1835, the Seminole Indian leader Oxelia Mekanopa and jumpers were victorious in defeating the U.S. Army in a joint African and Native American strategy. The United States attacked the Seminoles of Florida for their principal stand in providing a refuge for runaway African slaves in the Seminole nations where they were given full human rights. December 30th, 1939, Lourdes Casal Valdez was born, a Cuban-American poet, scholar, and radical activist. At first, she was not supportive of the Cuban Revolution and left Cuba to live in the United States. However, the racism she observed in the U.S. and her travels in 1962 to Africa, as well as her direct involvement in the U.S. Black liberation struggle, changed her views of socialism. She returned to Cuba in 1973 and traveled often between Cuba and the United States, organizing the Antonia Machado Brigade to support the Cuban Revolution. December 29, 1923, Cheikh Anta Diop, the Pharaoh of Knowledge, a Senegalese Egyptologist, historian, anthropologist, physicist, and politician, was born. Considered the greatest African historian of the 20th century due to his PhD thesis at the University of Paris that documented that the ancient Egyptians were black. His continued research documented that the earliest known human civilizations in North Africa were black, not European. December 29, 1911, Dr. Sun Yat-sen is named the first president of the Republic of China and considered the father of the nation. Dr. Sun Yat-sen played a major role in overthrowing the 2,000 year of imperial or feudal dynasties of China. He led successful revolutionary governments to unite China, challenging Chinese warlords who controlled much of the divided nation of China. He was a fervent Pan-Asianist. Dr. Sun Yat-sen states that the problem between the East and the Europe is a cultural contradiction, the rule of right versus the rule of might. The rule of right, Asian culture, respects benevolence, good deeds, and virtue, whereas the rule of might respects only force and violence. Hence, Pan-Asianism must be based on a cultural foundation of the historical culture of the rule of right. December 30th, 1904, Japan defeats Russia over contested land in Manchuria and Korea. This is the first time in the last several hundred years an Asiatic country defeats a European power, which gives inspiration to the anti-colonial Asian movements. December 30th, 1890, the massacre at Wounded Knee. 200 old men, women, and children were slaughtered by the United States Army during an armed conflict between the Oglala, Lakota, and the U.S. Army seeking ethnic cleansing. The U.S. government broke a Lakota Treaty Agreement establishing the Great Sioux Reservation in order to accommodate European settler, colonialist, insatiable desire for Native American land. December 31st, 1917, Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan, historian, Egyptologist, is born in Gondar, Ethiopia. Dr. Ben is the author of numerous books primarily on the ancient Nile Valley civilization and their impact on Western civilization. His writings include We the Black Jews, Africa, Mother of Western Civilization, African Origins of Modern Western Civilization, Black Men of the Nile, and numerous others. Dr. Ben trained cadres of Africans and U.S. scholars on Africa's proper contribution to world civilization, combating the European anthropological view that Africa had no history until the Europeans stepped foot in Africa. January 1st, 1789, Haiti gains independence. Haiti was the first liberated nation and republic in the Western Hemisphere, providing a continued model of African resistance to oppression. Historically and today, the United States and France have targeted Haiti for permanent destabilization. This is due to its historical role as a beacon of African self-determination. January 1st, 1923, Africa's foremost film director and writer, Ousmane Sembène, was born at Casamance, Senegal. He was a Wolof Muslim and is considered the father of African films. He was a member of the French Communist Party and a trade unionist in his younger days and evolved to become the leading Pan-Africanist filmmaker. The themes of his films address social change and contradictions in African society, as well as their interaction with the French colonial and neo-colonial regime. A partial list of his most famous films include Zala, Chedo, Fate Kene, Molade, and Mandambi. January 1st, 1994, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement is signed, and the indigenous people of Chiapas, Mexico, declare war. The Mayans, under the leadership of the Zapatista, the armed revolutionary group based in the poorest state in Mexico, built autonomous regions breaking from the Mexican neo-colonial government. The Zapatistas are part of the anti-globalization social movements, as well as return to the indigenous pre-Columbus cultural and social relations. January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara lead a group of students, intellectuals, and workers to overthrow the CIA and mafia-controlled Batista regime, giving rise to the oldest socialist government in the Western Hemisphere, Cuba. This is the second socialist revolution in the Western region, the first being the democratically elected government of Dr. Chetty Jagan of Guyana in 1954. Every U.S. president since Dwight Eisenhower, numbering 13, have all pledged to overthrow the socialist government off the coast of Florida, and every U.S. administration has failed due to the ideological and organizational sophistication of the masses of Cubans who are fully involved with the Cuban Revolution. January 1st, 1804, Sister Defile, an African prisoner of war leader, was born. She was a Dambala priestess, practitioner of African dance rituals, as the wife of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Haiti's first president. As a priestess, she used religion as an ideological weapon of liberation to organize slaves and called for the rebellion against French colonialism, which led to Haiti's independence. January 2nd, 1920, over 5,000 people are arrested in the anti-radical Palmer raids by the United States government. In June 1917, the U.S. Congress passes the Espionage Act, setting punishments for acts of interference in foreign policy. Prison terms of up to 20 years are set for anyone who obstructs the military draft or encourages disloyalty against the U.S. government in its foreign policy. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at Freedom Now. We ask you to join us in this African chant of unity, Amandala Awetu, 3 times, which means the power belongs to we the people.
Amandla
Awetu.
Amandla
Awetu.
Amandla
Awetu.
For KPFK Pacifica, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Casarae Abdul-Ghani, Associate Professor of English at Temple University in Philadelphia, and author of the book Start a Riot, Civil Unrest in Black Arts Movement, Drama, Fiction, and Poetry. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Abdul-Ghani.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Horne. How are you?
Okay, thank you for joining us. So why did you produce this book, Start a Riot?
Well, I wrote the book because I wanted to examine the grievances of Black Americans during the time of the 60s, to understand the shortcomings enacted by such laws, such as the Civil Rights Act that was created to protect citizens from discrimination. But as we know, those laws still did not provide all of the affordance for Black people to prosper in society, meaning that Black people were still discriminated against even afterwards. And so looking at the riot, or really the uprising, is for me to understand how it's examined artistically. So I look at the works of Ben Caldwell, his play, Riot, Sell or Dollars, Psyche Fake Out, Amiri Baraka's works as well, his plays, as well as Sonia Sanchez and Gwendolyn Brooks, and how they recant Black America's discontent and also their understanding of what does it mean to state a grievance. I argue that the grievance is valid because it's really pertaining to the well-being and the welfare of Black people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what the book examines.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned Ben Caldwell. Talk to us about him.
Yes, so in the book Start a Riot, I found his 1968 play Riot Cell or Dialer Psyche Fake Out to be very interesting because the play is a one-act play in which many writers of the Black arts movement they wrote one-act plays to really serve as a didactic message to get across the issues of the day. So in that work, it examines the issue of police brutality. It also deals with the conflicts or the conversations about reparations and whether or not, if Black people receive reparations, is it just out of charity or is it really, a way to advance the revolution? And from my understanding of how I read the play, what Caldwell is arguing is that money is not going to save Black America. Rather, what's going to save us is revolution and being able to have a clear, consciousness of what liberation and freedom looks like.
Now, in that play, are there any echoes or scenes that depict Los Angeles?
It actually depicts New York City because it focuses on the Harlem Bedford-Stuyvesant uprising that happened in 1964. So it doesn't focus on Los Angeles, but I think with Caldwell and with Sanchez, Baraka, or Leroy Jones, all of the uprisings that they refer to is really a microcosm of what was happening in different inner cities. So when we talk about Watts, Los Angeles, yes, we know in 65 that an uprising happened there as well. So if you read each of the plays, the focus becomes a larger conversation about the grievances that Black America have regarding issues of civil rights, issues of police brutality, and housing inequality.
Now, you mentioned Sonia Sanchez. Who was she? And talk to us about how she fits into your story.
Yes, well, Sonia Sanchez is an acclaimed poet, and she also was a professor at San Francisco State. She was part of the early formation of the Black Studies and Ethnic Studies coalition among Black students and students a part of the Third World Liberation Front who wanted to read about, see, hear, and study the works of people that look like them in their classrooms. So Sonia Sanchez is an interesting figure in Start a Riot because I focus on her plays as opposed to her poetry because she wrote both plays and poetry in the 60s. Her poetry took off, but my focus in looking at her plays, Sister Sanji and The Bronx is Next, is again offering this conversation about Black America's grievance regarding the issues of recurrent racism and how it trickles into systemic issues. So Sonia Sanchez is a major figure through her one-act dramas. That's what I look at with her work.
Now, you mentioned Amiri Baraka. Do you look at his poetry, his plays, or both? And who was he, for those who may not be familiar?
Yeah, so Amiri Baraka also taught at San Francisco State for a period during that creation of Black Studies. He was well known and well renowned as a poet, as well as he was an artist. He did pretty much everything. He wrote poetry. He was a poet laureate in Newark, New Jersey. That's where he's based out of. That's where he's from. But he was also a playwright. And so I look at his plays as well. So I'm very interested in looking at dramatic works and how they serve as methods for talking about inaction and how the writer sees the issues of inaction being played out in the streets of various urban neighborhoods across the United States.
Now, part of your work, Professor Abdul-Ghani, deals with the Black arts movement. What do you mean by invoking that phrase, and how does it manifest in Los Angeles?
So the Black arts movement that occurred in the mid-60s in 1965 was a movement that was birthed out of the call for Black power. It had many luminaries such as Amiri Baraka, Ben Caldwell, and in Los Angeles in particular, there were different artistic enclaves that reached from Los Angeles all the way to the Oakland Bay Area, where different writers would come together across different regions to use their art to talk about the social issues of the day. So the Black arts movement that appeared in 1965 up until 1975 was very important in shifting the consciousness of everyday Black people, thinking about and using their art as a tactic for liberation. And so in Los Angeles, you had very many active proponents that, participated. I don't necessarily talk about them. I talk about Judy Juanita out of Oakland because she was one of the students of Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez.
Mm-hmm. And what role does hip hop play in your body of work?
So hip hop is important. I teach hip hop and I have written about it through the use of Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. But I also talk about how hip hop uses the language of uprising in the early days, specifically thinking about the 80s and the 90s, uses the language of the uprising to speak about the grievances of Black America that have to do with issues of education, housing, discrimination in the workplace, or what have you. So ways that the rapper that's really the conscious member of the community that's speaking about the daily issues of the day. That's how I talk about hip hop in my writings and in my classroom.
Mm-hmm. Now, offline, we had a brief conversation about the movie, The Last Black Man in San Francisco, which starred Danny Glover and Jonathan Majors, amongst others. And of course, you have roots up north. What are your reflections about that particular film?
Yeah, so that film really deals with conversations about the Great Migration that in California per se are really under contextualized. So as we know, in the 30s and 40s, African Americans, migrated to various parts of the country, particularly in California. My family in particular, they came from Louisiana and Mississippi and Texas to Oakland and San Francisco. And so they also had a Victorian house that they rented in the Fillmore. And so the Last Black Man in San Francisco resonates with me because it really deals with this concern about the limbo that Black people are faced with when not having enough money to buy the American dream, but then on the other hand, still trying to find ways to create community and to create community as well as to nurture the next generation. So I was the next generation in the 90s in San Francisco. So the Last Black Man in San Francisco, deals with those issues. What does it mean to be displaced from the city after you've lived there so long? And what does it mean when no one cares where you are, placed or where you go? So there's a line in that movie by Tashina Arnold, who is one of the characters, and she says, if San Francisco does not love you, then F San Francisco. And I think that that's a powerful statement because it points to the fact that for all of our lives, Black Americans have had to have self-determination. And so with that self-determination, we have had to create our own ways of being well and finding connections and community. And so, yeah, that movie is very significant and we need more discussions about it.
Finally, Professor Abdul-Ghani, author of the book Start a Riot, what's next on your research agenda?
Yes, so I am working on several books. The first book is called African American Literature and Transition, 1970 to 1979, and it's co-authored with Marlo Denise David, and it looks at African American literature and culture in the 1970s through Toni K. Bambara to also Blaxploitation films and, all things 1970, but really sort of contextualizing how we understand the 70s moment, which ushered in how we talk about Black studies today. So that's my next work that I'm working on, and it's out of Cambridge University Press.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Professor Abdul-Ghani, Associate Professor of English at Temple University, author of the book Start a Riot. Thank you for joining us on KPFK's Freedom Now, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24, South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
Thank you, Flora, and now we go to our prison radio commentaries.
A Native American's views of Virginia's Red Onion State Prison. This is an exchange featured on Manhattan. During January 2024, I was transferred away from Virginia's notoriously racist and abusive Red Onion State Prison after participating in a group hunger strike protesting conditions at the prison. My strike ultimately lasted 71 days. I returned to the prison during September 2024, where I was placed in general population for just over a month, but was ultimately thrown in solitary confinement after officials claimed I was trying to procure weapons to attack guards after they attempted to instigate conflicts between me and other prisoners by trying to put hits on me and spread false rumors that I am a pedophile, rapist, and a snitch. Numerous prisoners came forward as witnesses to this to my attorneys. No weapons were ever recovered from me, however, so an inmate informant, Dennis Webb, was used to implicate me in all this. In a statement he gave Red Onion investigators that I received copies of in litigation I had against Red Onion officials. In the solitary cell block, I was housed in a cell next to Arlen Hatton, a Native American who was recently transferred to Red Onion from South Dakota, and he witnessed my efforts to challenge and bring public attention to the conditions at Red Onion, which he commended. Although reluctant, he agreed to share and for me to publish his impressions about Red Onion, given the perspectives of someone new to the prison and Virginia who had no agenda for or against Virginia officials. This article expresses Arlen's perspectives, which he gave during an exchange between us in latter 2024 November. Arlen was surprise transferred to Red Onion on October 6, 2024, directly from a South Dakota prison. He received no prior notice or hearing to facilitate nor contest the transfer. Arlen is a registered Oglala Lakota Sioux, who was a spiritual leader among Native Americans in the South Dakota prison system. When he arrived at Red Onion, he was escorted into the prison from the transport vehicle by a group of guards led by Lieutenant Joshua Massengill. Massengill made a lasting impression on Arlen with his first remarks to him, namely, quote, "Don't give officers here a hard time, because we will fuck you up," end quote. Arlen said he initially laughed in response, not thinking it was meant to be taken seriously. I asked if he now took it serious. He replied with an emphatic, "Yes." I asked what changed his mind. He responded that he had seen how quickly things can and do escalate from 0 to 100 with guards at the prison. Arlen said in just the 2 months he had been at Red Onion, he'd seen guards repeatedly tear gas prisoners in the cell block for next to nothing. Many others he'd seen slammed face first to the floor or beaten while restrained from behind. Others still he'd seen attacked by groups of guards dressed out in body riot armor. He even witnessed an elderly prisoner beaten by a group of guards who just entered his cell and attacked him for no cause. He noted the psychological effect of Red Onion on prisoners. It's that if they get out of line in the slightest way, or guards even believe they have, the situation will instantly go from something small to something huge, which induces a sense of terror, like experiencing an abusive parent. He feels he was sent to Red Onion to instill fear in him, because he is not supposed to have gone there as a new admission to the Virginia prison system in the first place. As a new intake, he was supposed to go to Virginia Department of Corrections Reception Center, Nottoway Correctional Center, to be classified and orientated into the prison system. But instead, he was sent to a super maximum security prison before he had even been classified to any security level at all. Worse still, once he was classified at Red Onion, he scored a level 3 security level, which is medium security, meaning he didn't meet the level 5 and 6 security levels of Red Onion and was by Virginia's own prison policy never supposed to have been housed there. Arlen said his biggest takeaway from observing and experiencing Red Onion officials is their total lack of decency or moral fiber. Quote, "They have no sense of right or wrong," end quote, he noted. With them, quote, "It's my way or the highway," end quote. Arlen said Red Onion staff simply don't treat prisoners as human beings, in which case they obviously didn't regard them as such. He points out that their practices of hurting and abusing people only traumatizes the victims, worsening their problems. Quote, "They're only doing more damage," end quote, he pointed out. I responded that these officials have no intention of helping us. Their abuse is motivated by disdain, hatred, and a condition compulsive to dehumanize us, with which he agreed. He noted that officials at Red Onion are deeply deceitful. They merely pay lip service to being humane, rule-abiding, and considerate, and one must take everything they say with a grain of salt. They almost never do what they say they will when it is something of benefit or service to a prisoner. They lie as a matter of routine. He advises one to not believe anything they say. He says facility requests, he writes, never come back. When he first got to the prison, he was told by counselors that they would contact his family and let them know where he was. They never did. He observed that when around me, all the guards were required to wear and activate body cameras. And with the cameras on, their demeanor immediately changed from not talking or being arrogant and rude to being courteous and polite. But as soon as they turned the cameras off, they were not nice at all and seemed relieved to drop the act and take off their masks. He said he avoids trouble with them by simply not talking to them or giving them any reason to notice him. He observes they are openly racist and sees the way blacks are treated at Red Onion a lot like he has experienced racism as a Native American. He wants to be away from Red Onion as soon as possible. This is Kevin Rashid Johnson coming to you from within America's Gulag Archipelago. Dare to struggle, dare to win. All power to the people.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Zimbabwe joined the No More Death Row movement. The Southern African nation of Zimbabwe, formerly known as Rhodesia, under Britain's colonial rule, has recently done something remarkable. The nation of some 14.5 million people announced recently that it has abolished the death penalty. Some 60 souls languished on Zimbabwe's death row. They're now on the grip of going out of solitary confinement into population, I presume. I learned this while listening to radio recently. Reportedly, Amnesty International made the request to the nation, and government spokesman said they have been wanting to do that in the first place. Seems like things are changing after all. With love, not fear, this is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
In these times, right, in terms of what's happening in the world, and most especially what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, it's important to hear a Jewish anti-Zionist voice. And Suzanne has been that for many, many years. So I congratulate her for putting her work out there for people to ponder and think about, especially at this time. So
this is a call from Pennsylvania State Correctional Institution, Mahanoy.
So I joined the list of people congratulating her for putting it into the world. Congratulations, Dr. Suzanne Ross.
Thank you, Maria.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Crystal Nicole Eddins, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh and author of the book Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, Collective Action in the African Diaspora. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Crystal Nicole Eddins.
Thank you so much for having me, Professor Horne.
Thank you for joining us. So why did you write this book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution?
Sure. So I wrote this book for a couple of reasons. The main one being that I wanted to, was because that there was a lack of scholarship, or that I wanted to see more scholarship that centered the Haitian Revolution within an African perspective. There is a great amount of literature, especially in the past 10 to 15 years, that has exploded around Haitian revolutionary studies. But I really wanted to place Africa and Africans at the center of that narrative, and to really begin to decenter France and Enlightenment ideals, and to really take seriously the cultural, religious, and political legacies and influences of the enslaved African people who had been brought into Haiti, not just in the 18th century, but the long-term impact, beginning with the first Africans that had been brought to the island in the late 15th century under the Spanish colonial regime. And the ways that even going back to that time period can help us better have a better and clearer perspective of the longue durée practice and resistance tradition that enslaved Africans had imbued within that island space leading up to 1791.
So how did you get interested in the Caribbean and Haiti?
Sure. So as an undergraduate and graduate at Michigan State University, I had the opportunity to study with a lot of great professors who were specialists in African studies, African diaspora studies, African American studies. And so in my coursework, I had developed an interest around, just social change and the mechanisms of social change and social movements and how Black people came together to mobilize to change and transform their conditions. And I was really curious also about the roles that women and religion played in facilitating those types of transformational events. At that time, I took a class on Caribbean spirituality. And it was then that I learned about Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, and particularly that I learned about the Bois Cayman ceremony, which was a ceremony and a sacred gathering of the African and African descendants from across the northern plain in colonial Haiti, who gathered approximately a week before the August 1791 uprisings and called upon their West and West Central African deities to sacralize and legitimate the uprising and to provide a sacred protection. And one of the leaders of that gathering is said to have been a woman named Cecile Fatiman, who is known as a kind of a Vodou Mambo, or a priestess within the Vodou tradition. And then she later marries a man who would later become one of the presidents of Haiti. But just learning about that ceremony and the role that it played in galvanizing the enslaved rebels, the would-be rebels across the northern plain, and building that sense of solidarity, and the fact that a woman was showing up in the historical record as having a really powerful role in guiding that gathering was what kind of captured my attention, and I just kind of continued to run with it. I initially wanted to do the dissertation on women in the Haitian Revolution, but short of archival information or access to archival information that could kind of really speak to more women's experiences, I chose to begin to explore the Maroons, to not only have more access to information about women, because there are more women in those advertisements, the runaway advertisements, but there is also, again, another lens through which to begin to understand how were enslaved people, enslaved Africans resisting before 1791. What were the terms that they were attempting to negotiate in their everyday lives? How were they building solidarity and building connections and networks amongst themselves that would then lead to or create the foundation for what would be the rebel armies that would go on to eventually defeat 3 European armies. And so that was kind of the trajectory of the project, and it's still living with me, and I'm still living with it.
You mentioned the rebel army that defeats 3 major European armies, the French, the Spanish, and the British. Is it fair to assume that the Africans who were dragged across the Atlantic brought with them military skills?
Sure, yeah, and other scholarship people like John Thornton and others, other Africanist scholars have kind of helped to really clarify the ways that, or the conditions, I should say, the social, economic, political, and military conditions in various contexts along the Atlantic African coastlines, right? And the ways that the transatlantic slave trade was contributing to a heightened militarism among the peoples of the Gold Coast, the peoples of Dahomey, the Congo Kingdom, an increasing sense of militarism, increasing inter-imperial conflicts, increasing civil wars that were all very much connected to struggles for control over the slave trade, control over territory, as Europeans were, beginning to encroach upon the continent and kind of instigate these conflicts and funnel in arms and guns and weapons in exchange for human chattel, right? And so I do think that in that increased and heightened sense of that heightened militarism that is happening across the coastlines, that Africans are arming themselves, right? They're engaged in warfare and in battles with one another, with Europeans. And so through that sense of militarism, and also, to kind of shout out the work of Vincent Brown, who also kind of outlines this process. I believe that it's through that military experience that many captives who in a lot of cases were captives of war, would then bring some of that experience, some of that expertise, and some of that knowledge with either indigenous or African indigenous forms of warfare fighting, such as the hand-to-hand combat, and other forms of pugilism and other fighting styles. That would then become useful in maroon communities, as these maroon communities are seemingly kind of orchestrating their own kind of unique ways of contesting and fighting back against colonial authorities that are trying to invade their spaces. And then later, as we see with the Haitian Revolution, that there are various examples of battles and skirmishes and fighting styles that are unique, or at least that Europeans believed were unique to African people.
Mm-hmm. You alluded a few moments ago to the question of cultural and religious heritage and the role it plays in your pages. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. So when we think about the kind of world that the enslaved captives, African captives, were leaving or being forced from in their homelands, and the various, institutions, the social, economic, religious, political, and cultural institutions that shape their lives, and then the world in which they're entering in colonial Haiti, one that is, vastly different, and one that includes a much wider variety of African peoples that they may or may not have ever encountered before, prior to the Middle Passage. I think about that process of interaction, or what some scholars would call like a transculturation, or just the kind of groupings of enslaved people coming together from these various ethnic backgrounds, geographic backgrounds, religious, linguistic groupings. All of those things, I believe, were helping to shape their worldview in the colony, and the ways that they would go about resisting, the ways that they would go about not only resisting, but also just living out their everyday lives, the kinds of ritual practices that they engaged in as they, interacted with their spirit beings, and interacted with the sacred world. Even their sacred ideas around childbirthing and processes around sexuality, processes around the distribution of sacred artifacts that would help to build their sense of protection in the world. So in the book, I kind of argue that the sacred plays an important role across enslaved people's communities, and across African ethnicities, even as they may have been articulated differently. And even as people were beginning to interact with one another and exchange some of these practices and learn some of these practices from one another, and begin to recognize some legible, or what is the word I'm looking for? Some similarly legible practices and similarly legible deities like the Orisha, who, kind of span geographic locations. And so, what would it mean for someone who is described as an Arada and someone who is Igbo to have a mutual or shared understanding of Ogun as, the Orisha and deity of warfare and iron. And so I would argue that some of these kinds of practices and shared understandings would help to begin to form the basis of the commonalities that brought people together. And that would help to, again, forge that sense of solidarity and community building amongst the enslaved who, again, coming from the African continent, may not have ever interacted with one another, or come into contact on the African continent, but are kind of forced to reconcile their differences in the colonial context.
What do you say in your pages about relations between the free Negro population, so-called, and the enslaved population?
Sure, I think that this is a really complex question given the overall structure of colonial Haiti. So Haiti was, as well as other French colonies, were maybe somewhat unique in comparison, for example, to North America, because in these French colonies, the Code Noir was the kind of royal policy related to, dictating the terms of slavery in the Caribbean. And within the Code Noir, it was allowed, there were provisions that allowed free white men to either marry or recognize African women and their progeny. And so in these colonies, and especially in colonial Haiti, over the course of the 18th century, you had a small but powerful and wealthy minority of what were called the gens de colère, the mixed race population who, descended from enslaved women in many cases, and from free white, and in many cases landowning, and in some cases slave owning white men. And so these free communities had varying degrees of connection and relationship to the enslaved. There, on one end, there were members of the gens de colère who, readily distanced themselves from any identification with Africanness, with African people. They enslaved African people for profit, and were very much deeply invested in the maintenance of that system. On the other hand, there were also free people of color who were more recently emancipated, who had not been free for generations, but perhaps had gained their freedom through their own labor, or had been emancipated by an enslaver. And so their connections to the enslaved population were much more intimate. Some of those people, again, continued to engage in familial relationships with those who were enslaved. Some of these free affranchis, the newly freed, may have owned slaves, but in some cases these were like family members. So this was a mechanism of emancipating other, family members, spouses, children. So there's a range that's happening in terms of the ways that the free people of color engaged and interacted with the enslaved. But in my book, I tend to kind of focus more on the kind of the latter end, where we see examples of free people of color acting in collaboration with the enslaved, acting in, or at least being accused of acting in collaboration with the enslaved and with Maroons, and being a conscious part of the types of liberation activities that were not only, exclusive to their own conditions, but to the broader Black condition in the colony. So some of the examples of this, when we look at even leaders of the Haitian Revolution, like a Toussaint Louverture, who was a free man for, I believe, at least 2 decades or a decade and a half before the Haitian Revolution begins. Another one of the major leaders, there's a book by Terry Ray that recently came out about him, Romain La Prophetesse. He was also a free man of color who, when the revolution began, kind of, again, not only relied on kind of Catholic and Afro-Catholic rituals and symbols to kind of galvanize a mass base, and many who were included in that base were also, Maroons and others who were invested in, destroying the plantation system. And so even as many free people of color were invested in, again, maintaining and profiting from the slavery colonial system, there were others who were invested in destroying it.
Finally, Crystal Nicole Eddins, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, author of the book Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution. Would you recommend to the youth in our audience that they consider matriculating at the University of Pittsburgh?
Sure. One of the things that I think makes our sociology department really unique in comparison, for example, to other sociology departments, is that we have a kind of an intentional focus on social movements, activism, and so several of our faculty are either studying social movements and or are engaged in activism and advocacy themselves. And so my hope is that by having recently joined the faculty is to kind of contribute to that by helping to create and open up opportunities to study and take part in Black radical traditions, both in and off campus. There's a very vibrant Africana Studies department here at the University of Pittsburgh, and so I do think that there's a lot of room for those who are interested in studying global Blackness, those who are interested in thinking about Black radicalism and the potentials of Black radicalism, especially in the climate, the political and economic climate in which we live, that I think kind of demands and requires some deep thinking and consideration and action toward abolishing systems of inequality and oppression.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Professor Eddins, author of the book Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Crystal Eddins, Dr. Casarae Abdul-Ghani, and also, given that Dr. Abdul-Ghani had mentioned about Ben Caldwell's work here in Los Angeles, we wanted to invite the community. Ben Caldwell's Chaos Network here in Leimert Park, Africatown. In the 90s, Chaos Network was the home of Project Blowed, the legendary open mic night that fostered forward-thinking, musically complex, and lyrically profound jazz-influenced rappers. And the community is invited to attend Project Blowed's 30th anniversary event happening tomorrow, Sunday, December 29th, here in Los Angeles at Los Globos from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m. It's 21 and over with the valid ID for entry, no exceptions. There will be 2 floors, 3 rooms. We'll see you there. You can get tickets for the Project Blowed 30th anniversary party on Dice, Eventbrite, and Bandcamp. Los Globos is located at 3040 Sunset Boulevard. And we also wanted to thank our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon, and all those who made today's program possible. Please stay tuned for our sister Sumta coming up next with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. And signing off for this 2024 final Saturday, this is Sister Thage, and until next week, next year, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.